So we're going to review the arguments that Richard made. By the way, I'm not really interested in being the head of some movement, so I'm not here to. I'm not really involved in politics. I'm a little more black pill when it comes to that stuff. My view is that we really have to kind of re-Christianize the world and the West, I should say, because if you have an Orthodox perspective, then you've basically got a several centuries long apostasy, and now literally people walk around acting like heathens and pagans. They have gauges in their ears and freaking bones in their nose, and they look like walking cartoons with so many tattoos. And I mean, we're really just returning to heathenism. I'm not saying that everybody with a tattoo is evil, but I'm saying it kind of speaks to this return to some kind of primitivism, primalism, and archaism. And now, in the alternative media sphere, we're starting to see, and this has kind of been around for a little while, the idea of Odin and Wotan and the bubblings of these kinds of Nordic gods, and now it's getting promoted really heavily, or pretty consistently. And no, obviously we don't buy into all of that. We have to reject that. We are monotheists. If you want to hear my talks specifically on that, I've done one on Gnosticism and refuting Gnosticism, which is applicable to this. I've done one on St. Athanasius's book, his little small book against the heathen, which is good in this regard, and the lecture a couple weeks ago on Genesis. And of course, we will continue through Genesis. I think we will have a better presentation than other people who try to lecture on Genesis. And so somebody is trying to organize I don't know if it'll be a debate. I will have to, agree to whatever he wants to do. But someone is trying to organize a debate / discussion or whatever with Jordan Peterson. So that'll be big time, baby. Stuff is we're exploding, we're growing. That's good. Remember, everybody, to check out my comrades, because I'm a Russian bot. Be sure to check out 21st Century Wire. Be sure to check out Alternate Current Radio. Be sure to check out Boiler Room that we do every Thursday night. So we'll be doing Boiler Room tomorrow night. Fun shows. And again, it'll be exciting to talk to Jordan Peterson if that happens. Who knows? You never know when this stuff. But it seems like most things that get just whispered about come about, don't they? The debate with JF did happen. The debate with Nick happened. The debate with Kokesh happened. The debate with Spencer happened. So hopefully we can have a profitable discussion with Jordan Peterson. I think that would be profitable because he does have this interest in Orthodox Christianity, and we do have a mutual contact that Jordan often speaks with at conferences. Jonathan Pageau, I think is how you say his name, the icon artist guy, and so. If I get to talk to Jordan Peterson, I think I'm going to really just kind of focus on the theological topics. I'll focus on, so you have an interest in Orthodoxy. What about it? Do you not find convincing? And, can we maybe talk about these issues that you have with the Bible's historicity, and doubting the historicity as I understand your position, terms of things like Genesis and your kind of overboard originist type position on allegory and this kind of stuff. That's probably where I will ask questions. And, if he doesn't seem too triggered, maybe even question classical liberalism, because I don't hear any kind of questioning of classical liberalism. And really, I think if we are consistent in our philosophy, in our worldview, in our orthodoxy, we have to question classical liberalism, because classical liberalism arises from the spirit of the Enlightenment. Read Fire in the Minds of Men. And we see that it's an atheistic, Freemasonic, essentially satanic revolution at root. And so there's really no way to combine that with the claims of Christ, the claims of historic orthodoxy, the presentations of the ecumenical councils. Those are diametrically opposed to classical liberalism, and there's no way to mesh these two. So all of these Ameridox and the liberal Orthodox in America, Orthodox so-called, and the extreme ecumenists, the Rod Dreher types, who want to combine libertarianism or some form of classical liberalism with orthodoxy, that is just utterly absurd. And you notice these people tend to really be just dastardly people on a personal level. Every so-called Orthodox person I've met that claims to be like a libertarian or a liberal or a class, I mean, they're just lunatics. Like Frankie Schaeffer, this kind of person. I mean, I know he's not libertarian, but he's like now the darling of the mainstream social justice warrior left, and he's essentially apostate. I don't even think he says he's still Orthodox, but I don't think he actually believes in a deity. So let's talk about Richard Spencer's arguments. Richard said basically everything I expected. I kind of forgot that Richard has these Protestant liberal, older liberal Protestant presentations of how the church came to be. And I don't think he's ever questioned that. He probably, left his Episcopalian theology, long ago and never looked back, and so probably didn't really see any reason to question those assumptions. But those assumptions are wrong. The Alexander Hislop, which actually isn't a liberal presentation, this was a kind of, anti-Roman Catholic, free church, Presbyterian and Methodist, and then later evangelical adopted kind of conspiracy theory view of the history of so-called Babylonian religion, pan-Babylonianism, passing into Roman Catholicism. And so there's a similarity of the hat that the Pope wears to, some image of Enki or something from Babylon. So therefore, right, because there's a similar, and this is literally the level of like Darwinism stuff. Darwinism's like, oh look, there's a kind of similarity between a zygote here and a human baby there, so therefore they have the same origins. That's quite literally the homology argument. It's literally at the same level as Alexander Hislop, which is preposterous. I mean, you have to have, it's zeitgeist level stuff. It's zeitgeist. Do you even zeitgeist, bro? I mean, and that's, and I don't mean to be rude or offensive to Spencer, but that's really the level of theology at which we're dealing here. Right? He has, he has a Seventh-day Adventist type argument that Constantine radically altered the church, and again, that's literally a Seventh-day Adventist argument. Utterly silly. No, I mean, anyone who has spent any time in the church fathers of the first 3 centuries prior to Nicaea, post-Nicene, anti-Nicene fathers, right? If you've read the post-apostolic and anti-Nicene fathers in any degree, you will see some weird things that pop up, some heresies that they had to battle. But so the first problem in Richard's presentation is his characterization of difficulties in the first 3 centuries of the church, such as maybe Tertullian's radical idea that you can't sin after baptism, or there's not really repentance. This extreme type view, or there were at times ascetics who took an extreme view that you can't participate in the military or something like that. That was not the characterization of the universal church. That was not the universal church's view. There might have been disputes over whether you could be remarried. This kind of stuff. So to characterize Jesus as the revolutionary kind of proto-hippie is really what Richard's argument was, is utterly unbiblical and ahistorical. And it's a characterization, again, that arises from older evangelicalism, evangelical conspiracy theories, oddly enough, and then later higher critical textual doubt. So higher criticism, this is really the root of this idea that Jesus is this radical discontinuity with the Old Testament. No, he's not. What does the Sermon on the Mount say? Do not think that I came to destroy the law and the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. And truly I say, heaven and earth will not pass away, right, until every jot and tittle, right, is fulfilled in the law. So there's nothing in the law contrary to Jesus, because Jesus gave the law. And this is actually a central tenet of Orthodox theology, of the Orthodox view of the covenant. When the early church fathers in the 2nd century are arguing against the Gnostics, when Irenaeus goes to great lengths to refute the many Gnostic sects and against heresies in 180, he stresses over and over and over the continuity of the Old and the New Testaments, because it's the Spirit of Christ that spoke in the Old Testament prophets. This is what the New Testament says. Now, Richard has absolutely no knowledge of this whatsoever. He has no knowledge of what Old Testament theology is, of what New Testament theology is. Richard's knowledge of biblical theology essentially comes from a kind of mixture, as we said, of the Alexander Hislop to Babylon's type view, zeitgeist type view, mixed with the neo-pagan characterization that Judaism was a bizarre system of syncretism itself that allowed a certain people group to trick everybody, and then Jesus rebelled against this, and so Jesus is sometimes kind of hallowed as this anti-Judaic figure, or a kind of rebel against the established religion. Right? He's the rebel. Now, in a sense, Jesus is the rebel, but the problem with all of these characterizations is that they don't believe Jesus is who he says he was. These are human, autonomous, fallen interpretations of who the character or person of Jesus was. And so you notice throughout the debate, Richard consistently said, well, I respect Jesus, this guy, right? Jesus is the dude, right? He's just this dude. He's buddy Jesus. He's a man. He's a guy. He is not the Logos, you see. He is not the second person of the Trinity. He's not the divine Son of God. He's just a guy, right? Jesus is not just a guy. If we read the texts, Jesus claims many times over that he fulfills all these prophecies and that he's the Son of God. Now, if he claims all that, then he is not a man to, then he's not a man to be emulated. He's a giant con man. I mean, if he's a giant con man, then on what basis does Richard have respect for Jesus? I mean, it doesn't really follow. Why would you have respect? I mean, Richard doesn't have respect for Jerry Falwell, because I'm sure he would see Jerry Falwell as a kind of con man. Jimmy Swaggart's a religious con man. Certainly we shouldn't have respect for either of those nefarious characters. So on what basis should we have respect for Jesus if he was just a guy claiming to be God? I mean, that's essentially homicidal, right? I mean, psychopathic. I mean, when there's like some Mexican guy who says he's Jesus. He's got some cult in Mexico or something. I forget his name, or maybe he's in California, but he's a Mexican guy. I mean, no one thinks this guy is, honorable. right? I mean, the yogis claim to be avatars of the deities, and quite often many of these yogis in their ashrams turn out to be con men. So that really makes no sense. I mean, it might be good PR to say I respect Jesus and I don't want to offend the Christians out there, but it's not consistent. And, you know, we're in a quasi debate, I guess we had halfway debate. Even in a halfway debate, surely we want to be logically coherent. So I would say that the first crucial thing to refute in Richard is the idea that the Bible is this Judaic type document that is radically different from what develops in the next 3-4 centuries of the church and into Constantine. And we can demonstrate that by looking at those church fathers in that period. Now, I've done many talks on this. I've explained this many times over, where all the claims that I kind of rattled off, you know, when we read Justin Martyr's works, we see him giving a fairly detailed presentation in about 150 of the liturgical practice of the church at that time. And what we see is that it's a direct inheritance of both the temple and the synagogue system of Jewish worship, which makes sense because when we read the book of Acts, we see that the early church begins as Jewish, and at Pentecost you have a few thousand converts made out of the Jews there to celebrate Pentecost. And then later in the book of Acts, of course, we have Peter and Cornelius, and then later Paul going to the Gentiles. And so the beginning of the church is both a Jew and Gentile establishment is there in Acts. And most of the time, evangelicals and Protestants just simply aren't aware of the fact that the liturgical worship of the early church, the ordered pattern worship, wasn't invented. They didn't make it up. It didn't evolve over time. Now, certainly aspects of the tradition evolved. That's why you're going to have a minor liturgical differences in certain areas. You'll have a little bit of difference between, the liturgy of St. James or the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom or something like that. But that it's liturgical worship is universal. It's not disordered. It's not chaotic. And it is not Richard's totally incorrect characterization of something like evangelical Protestantism, where he gets this idea that the modern, evangelical, non-denominational, minimalist, reductionist movements are somehow a return to primitive Christianity is utterly incorrect. And everything that I'm telling you from these church fathers, Irenaeus, Ignatius, St. Clement, when you go read them in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century, St. Athanasius, they do not teach anything like that. They all have a unified doctrine of bishops, the episcopate, of priests, of sacraments, of the Eucharist as the high point of the divine liturgy, ordered worship, church calendar, Easter, right, Christmas. These are all present in the early 100s, universally, by the way. And this is why I specifically brought that up, is because Richard got a lot of flack for tweeting an article that was trying to argue that Easter is really a Germanic, Teutonic, pagan holiday. And he got slammed, quite literally, on Twitter by just hundreds and hundreds of fedoras sent. People were sending him fedoras. The reason for this is because the historic, objective, verifiable fact about the origin of Easter is that it's Pascha, right? That is the Greek term in the Septuagint for Passover. The Easter, quote unquote, celebration, as it's called in the West, in the Orthodox Church, is the Passover. That's the meaning of the word in the Greek, and it's always been called that, right? And so this is why you have, even in 190, a very tense, heated controversy in the church all over Asia and Asia Minor over when the date of Easter is to be celebrated. So within 100 years of the apostles and the death of St. John, you already have liturgical disputes in the church. I mean, there are still liturgical disputes in the church today. But what that illustrates is that Richard's hierarchical assumption of the process of the development of theology in the first 4, 5, 6 centuries of the church is completely false. And secondly, to stress again, Richard's mistake is to not understand the relationship between the Old and New Testament. And this is difficult because so many people, number one, don't believe the Old Testament. They don't read it. They don't understand it. And they don't see how, Jesus is the fulfillment of all the typology and prophecies that are in the major and minor prophets that are all the way back to Genesis. I mean, this is really one of the strongest arguments for Christianity. I mean, granted, one has to kind of already be open to the idea. I mean, if I were to take arguments about the prophets to somebody like JF, an atheist or somebody like that, it's probably not going to have much effect because he doesn't really believe in the possibility of prophecy or inspiration to begin with. So, but because I was speaking to an audience that was probably hearing about orthodoxy for the first time ever, many of them, maybe Allsup or Baked Alaska, but who do have a kind of familiarity with Christianity. I wanted to illustrate that the prophecies in Daniel specifically speak of the world empires and the final world empire becoming Christianized. Now, this is not what John Hagee and all the idiot Hal Lindsey types think, that, there's this final end times European Union or some bullshit like that. No, it's talking about the empire that follows Greece. And there's no dispute anywhere about what empire followed Greece historically. It was Rome. And you can even read about this in the Maccabees. The books of the Maccabees charts the intertestamental period. You have to read the books of the Maccabees. They're great. And they show us this transition period between, the final minor prophets and, after the Jews had been through the Babylonian captivity and they returned home. And then you have the intertestamental period. You have the period of the Maccabees. And then you have the period of Christ born under the Roman Imperium. This is what Daniel predicts. And again, I bring this up so many times just because it's such a strong argument, and it's not the only one. How in the world would Daniel have known this? And Daniel is dated by liberal scholars at the latest in the 2nd century BC. So, and by the way, I didn't actually know this, but somebody was pointing out to me in the last few weeks that there's some kind of rabbinical curse that's pronounced on people who read Daniel 9 because it was such a strong... I mean, presumably it's pronounced on Gentiles that read Daniel 9. I'm not sure, but the idea is, it's really hard to get around this one because Daniel 9 is so strong in terms of saying that when the Messiah comes, he's going to die, and the temple the ceremonies will end. And that's exactly what happened, right? By the way, is Joe Atwell going to say that Daniel 9 is about the Flavian dynasty? Were the Maccabees, right? Even if you date Daniel as late as the Maccabees, was it predicting the Flavians? I mean, come on. No, these people don't know the Old Testament. They really don't. And if they go to the Old Testament, they kind of just pick these things out that they think sound cool. They don't really know what they're talking about. And I'm not trying to be arrogant, but I have put 20 years into studying the Old and New Testaments. This is originally what I went to college for. So I'm not trying to be unfair to Richard or fault him. I understand that, this is the kind of difficult re-education, re-Christianizing that we have to do due to so many decades and centuries, really, of deviation from classical Orthodox Christianity. And, you really, again, I'm not expecting everybody to just take my word for it. You can go and find these things very easily on your own. You don't have to go to New Advent, the Catholic Encyclopedia, and you can look up the early church fathers' works, from the first couple centuries. And you will see everything that I'm telling you there. And no, I'm not saying that to promote Catholicism. I'm just saying, Catholic Encyclopedia is the easiest, most well-known, accessible means by which people can look and see, what are the epistles of Ignatius? What is Justin Martyr's, treatise where he, talks about the liturgy, right? His apology and his debate with Trypho, or Saint Irenaeus against heresies, or Saint Ambrose, right? Or Saint Athanasius, any of these in these Nicene and pre-Nicene era church fathers. And what you'll see, as I pointed out, for example, in my death penalty essay that I wrote a while back, you will see that they do not have this revolutionary worldview that Richard claims they do. Depends on, I guess, what you mean by revolutionary. Richard tried to characterize it as they're all egalitarian and they're kind of like poor, pathetic people. That's not true. Even in the book of Acts, very prominent people, Roman centurions in the gospel. You have Festus and Agrippa, who seem open to Christianity, possibly even converting in the book of Acts. And into the early centuries of the church, it was not just low IQ poor people in this Nietzschean conception who were converted. Now, yes, Jesus says he does invite those people, and those people have a much better chance of coming to the kingdom of God and entering the church than the elite and the wealthy, precisely because they have very strong idols in their lives, right? Jesus says, I came to heal those who were sick, not the well. So, but we don't take from that out of context with everything else in the Gospels and everything else in the Bible. Just like Jesus, for example, we don't rip the Sermon on the Mount out of context and say, well, that's the only thing that matters. And so because Jesus says, love your enemies, you never can have defend yourself. No, that's ridiculous. Jesus himself defends himself. He practices self-defense at times. Are you aware of this? Did you know that? Did you know that Jesus handed his disciples a sword at one time and said, that at this time, this is what is appropriate to do, right? Jesus turns over the tables of the money changers. So we can't paint the picture of Jesus that we imagine, that we think. That's just an idol. When we make up this image of this person that we imagine in our heads, that is just another form of idolatry. Again, it is Jesus who gave in Exodus the law of self-defense. It is Jesus in Genesis and in Exodus who gave the death penalty. And the church always held this. The earliest church fathers that Richard thinks were these liberal revolutionaries, they believed in the death penalty. They believed in just war. I cite in my essay on patriarchy and death penalty, St. Athanasius talking about just warfare. The Maccabees engaged in just warfare for the defense of their homeland. And the Russian church today still defends that Maccabean principle of defending the homeland, fighting for your people. So all the things that Richard says are really accurate descriptions of degenerate, apostate, deformed, Western, heretical so-called Christianity, right? He's correct that if you're talking about Anglicanism, yeah, you're talking about, trannies in vestments. You're talking about, Druids. The Archbishop of Canterbury is a freaking Druid, quite openly. He celebrates Druid rites. They have no connection whatsoever to historic orthodoxy, except in name only. So all of Richard's character. Another. This is another point. We didn't actually get into this in debate, but Richard, I have heard a long time ago. I think the first time I heard him talk, he was giving a discussion many years ago about why he wasn't Christian. And it wasn't just the kind of Nietzschean stuff that we got into, but he made this point about, it's been shown that Jesus was a failed apocalyptic prophet. So in other words, he's got this kind of higher critical argumentation again, that there's all these prophecies, like when Jesus says that he'll return, his apostles will see his return, and it's that generation that will see his return, and oh look, he didn't return. So Jesus promised that he would return, and that generation in front of him would see it, and that he would destroy his enemies, and it didn't happen. So Jesus is a failed apocalyptic prophet. Now this stupid argument was raised by the higher critics 100, 150 years ago, and they don't understand preterism. And yes, every major church father, okay, from Eusebius to Athanasius to St. John Chrysostom, they all teach that Matthew 24 and Luke 21, for the most part, are describing the events of 70 AD. I'm sorry, but they do. And now, every now and then, I'll have somebody try to argue this with me. But you're wrong. They all talk about this. I covered this in my Athanasius talks that I just did, in the last couple months. And I show you the citations. Go to St. John Chrysostom's commentary on Matthew 24, and he will say this is about the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. Now, yes, full preterism is heresy. This is the idea that every prophecy is fulfilled and there's nothing else to be fulfilled. This is not true, because we are told that death will be destroyed, right, at the end of time. And I'm sorry, but that's not just talking about spiritual death. That's talking about physical death too. Paul says in Romans 8, the entire creation is subject to death and is destined to be cosmically renovated, transfigured, and restored through the resurrection of Christ. So this is the long and short of this is that Richard does not know what the idea of preterism is, which means already fulfilled. And this is the idea that the majority, and again, the easiest way to see this, right? Most people, evangelicals, they'll read Matthew 24 and, this is talking about the end of the world. So everything in this text, and the higher critics retort by saying, if you think that's talking about the end of the world, then you're a fool, because Jesus says in those texts that the people that he's talking to, there in front of him, his immediate audience, they will see those events. That generation will see it. There are some of you standing here who will not taste death until you see the kingdom of God coming in power. How is that possible? Because the kingdom of God coming in power, okay, extends from the time of Christ's initial coming, when you have in the Magnificat, Mary says that the birth of Christ is a fulfillment of the promises of the Davidic covenant. So here's the king. Here is the new King David right here. He's born, the seed of David. He will sit on his father's throne all the way through the death, burial, resurrection, and ascension, and Pentecost, book of Acts, right? All the way up to 70 AD. This whole period is the arrival of the kingdom. It is the transition point. It is the fulfillment of the administration from Adam, right, to Moses, to David, right, all the way up to the kingdom. The fulfillment of all those covenants and prophecies is now in this entire period. And the reason for the removal of the temple in 70 AD was multifarious. It was multiple. It fulfilled the prophecies that like I said, Daniel 9, or early on in Jeremiah, when Jeremiah says that in the kingdom, the Ark of the Covenant will not even come to mind, right? How is that possible? How is it possible that, go listen to my Jeremiah talk, that during the kingdom period, there would be no Ark of the Covenant? Jeremiah is talking about the actual literal Ark, right? Like the Indiana Jones Ark of the Covenant. And it's not in the Pentagon's underground base, by the way. Maybe it is. I don't know, maybe the original one is somehow in the Pentagon underground base. But the real Ark of the Covenant has arrived. So we are not worried about some box somewhere. The real Ark of the Covenant, which is in one sense both Mary and ultimately Christ himself, it has come. So we are not worried about that metal box. The fulfillment of the promise the warning, when we read Deuteronomy 28 through 30, we read the curses. These are the covenant curses. When Israel at Mount Sinai agreed to the Mosaic covenant, God warned them of all of these curses that would come upon them, even all of the curses on Egypt if they forsook the covenant and forsook God. And so many times then, throughout the history of Israel, when we read the books of the Kings, Samuel, etc., we see them falling away. We see the covenant enforced, and we see God bringing chastisement, plagues, destruction when they have apostatized. Those are covenantal enforcements, right? The legal sanctions of the covenant, and God bringing the chastisement upon them, that he said what he would do to their enemies if they were faithful. And thus, through this period of constant apostasy, which is why you end up with the Babylonian captivity, there are prophets, especially in the minor prophets, Hosea, who begin to say, this is getting so bad that you will be divorced. Now, how is that possible? How is it possible that God both divorces Israel and yet keeps his covenant of everlasting faithfulness to Israel? How is this possible? How is it not a contradiction? Well, it's possible because national Israel, when it rejected the Messiah, was subject to the covenant curses. When you read the book of the Apocalypse, you are reading the divorce letter of God to literal Israel. And that's why the Apocalypse says that the city that is the whore, again, throughout all the prophets, the city that is the whore, that is being divorced and destroyed, is the city where Christ was crucified. It's Israel. It's very clear. I cover that in the Jeremiah talk. And eventually, yes, we will get to an Apocalypse breakdown, the book of Revelation, for those that are Protestants. So this covenantal fulfillment aspect of the divorce of Israel, and yet God remaining faithful in his covenant by establishing the church, this is absolutely nowhere on Richard's radar. Now, and Richard probably isn't that interested in it. I don't know, how interested he is in this kind of stuff anyway. He seems to have a kind of just a passing interest maybe in theology and these issues. So this stuff, you can't understand like the Zionist, issue and this kind of stuff, as everybody kind of gets all hyped up about, without understanding these theological points. I mean, this really is the key to unlocking all these things. And until you use this key to unlock all these things, none of this stuff really makes sense. But when you look at it this way, it does make sense. And yes, there are still things to be fulfilled. Clearly, the later chapters of the Apocalypse speak of the end of death and Satan's power, ultimately and fully and finally. Well, that obviously hasn't happened yet. Okay, so full preterism is a heresy. But quite a few prophecies are talking about the destruction of the temple. Right? And so this whole period, again, from Christ's birth to the destruction of the temple, that is the transition phase, the establishing of the kingdom, the church. And then you have after that, okay, that's not the end of history. That's not all there is. You have the Christianizing of the Imperium, which is the full and total fulfillment of what Daniel said in Daniel 2, that the rock would smash the idolatrous imperial powers and it would grow into a world kingdom, and it would overtake all the other world kingdoms. So the church is destined to take over the world, And that's because, as Paul says in Ephesians 1, the church owns the world. The world is created for the church. Now, then, of course, the question is, well, what church? Well, it's not the Anglicans, I assure you. It's not Joel Osteen. And, I'm not going to argue Roman Catholicism right now, but look at Francis, right? I mean, come on. So back to the Richard debate. So these are crucial theological points, and if you're kind of mired in evangelicalism and Episcopalianism and Roman Catholicism in the West, and that's what you think Christianity is, it's kind of understandable how, people would get fed up. And as I've said many times, Western Christianity is so bad that it's basically just becoming an atheism factory. It's just churning out atheists. That's really all it's good for. So, we can't necessarily fault people for being honest and saying this stuff is ridiculous and it's becoming, engines for basically... Western Christianity is basically just another engine of the liberal imperium in whatever form. That's what it's becoming, whether it's Protestant or Catholic or whatever. So those are some central messages that I would hope to, get across to somebody that has this kind of worldview. Now, if this person is not even interested in theology at all or biblical issues or whatever, and they just opt for something like Nietzschean paganism, this is where we move to the next phase of Richard's apologetic for whatever. I don't know what exactly to call his worldview, but nihilistic Nietzschean Darwinism, I don't know, with mythology mixed in. I don't know. But that's actually another point that I want to critique too, is that it seems to kind of be a perfectly modern mix, right? Isn't that very interesting? Because, Richard is very anti-liberal, and yet the worldview that Richard puts forth is ultimately grounded in something very modern, very product of a long series of Western revolutions, believe it or not. And Nietzsche is a figure born of the revolutions prior to him. Now, and you say, well, now, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense because the revolutions are all left-wing, right? Well, that depends. Napoleon is a product of French revolutions. Is an emperor liberal? You tell me. I don't know. I mean, these terms kind of become ambiguous because these secular attempts in schools, that arise, as I said in the debate, as reactions to previous schools, they really don't solve the problems. They really just give us more problems. And that's because they're just autonomous man working in dialectics and never getting out of these dialectics, right? Western philosophy is plagued by dialectics all the way back to Plato. So when Richard appeals to Nietzscheanism, I find it odd because the major figures that Richard seems to base his worldview on, so he says, are Jesus, Nietzsche, and Darwin. And this really doesn't make any sense because all three of these figures can't really be combined with the others. Now, yes, does Nietzsche make some criticisms that are useful? Sure. There are some neat aphorisms in Nietzsche. I've read several of his works, grad classes on Nietzsche. I'm familiar with the Nietzschean perspective. So I'm not saying that there's nothing useful in Nietzsche, and there's usefulness in most philosophers to some degree. Maybe not in Voltaire, but in most philosophers there's some kind of, maybe not in Locke. There's not much in Locke at all, but not much in Bentham. I can't think of anything good in Jeremy Bentham. Anyway. But Nietzsche is a result of a series of revolutions and intellectual revolutions, and it's an odd kind of mix of a kind of cafeteria smorgasbord, postmodern. Let me have Nietzsche, let me have Jesus, let me have Roman Imperium, and a hefty dose of Darwin. Now, one of my central arguments that Richard did admit and kind of passed on was precisely this point of Richard taking the Spenglerian cultural relativism idea, which is what I disagree with Spengler on, central point. I like Spengler, but I think he's completely wrong about this. If it's true, I mean, Spengler kind of even thinks that Western Faustian man can't even understand what mathematics is in another culture. Like if you're in China and you're doing 2 + 2 = 4, you don't even know what that's like, because you're not of the spirit and soul of the Chinaman. So you can't even conceive of what it is to try to, count rice or something. I don't know. If you divide your fortune cookie, you can't divide it the way that it divides in the Chinaman's mind. Well, I'm sorry, but this is very easily refuted by the fact that the same mathematics that builds a bridge in America builds a bridge in China, right? The same technology based on mathematical principles that's used in China is used today. There might be advances, but those advances are going to be based on principles, right? Abstract entities and concepts that are invariant and unchanging, right? Pi is not going to not be pi tomorrow. 2 + 2 is not going to be 5 tomorrow. And it's not going to be 5 in China. So this belief that it's almost like reality is created by cultures is just obviously not true. And if that's the case, then Richard, by the way, this is actually an argument that Dugin makes. So I'm surprised that, maybe, I don't guess it's surprising. Maybe this is, I guess, an area where Spencer and Dugin would disagree. And I know that Spencer has some appreciation for Dugin, but, Dugin actually makes this point that Darwinian evolutionary biology, because it arises out of modern Western culture, and if you believe that everything is kind of culturally, contextually situated and limited, you cannot use this as a grand explanatory mythology or scientific mythology for all of history and all cultures. And that's precisely what Richard attempted to do. I think that this was a extremely strong argument against his position. There is no way to refute that. Next, I want to cover his response, which is the same response of every atheist and agnostic ever, which is that this is a parlor trick semantic word game. I think every atheist that I've debated or had this discussion with, or agnostic, whatever, they will initially, when they get this argument, that's their retort, this kind of emotive retort. Well, you got me in a word game. I was watching some guy's video after the debate, some YouTuber, a black guy. He was analyzing the debate, and he said, oh, Jay got Richard in a word game. Okay, no, and 100 times no. First of all, this is a contradiction. You can map this phrase or this claim in first order logic to be a contradiction. Contradiction is not a word game. It is not a liar's paradox. That is different, because a paradox is not a contradiction. If you have a basic logic class, you will learn that there are contradictions. Every time you engage in discussion and debate, you presuppose that people can't make, or that you ought not make contradictions. I mean, people will contradict themselves all the time, right? But the assumption, the intuitive sense that we all have is that it's wrong to contradict. It's wrong to present falsehoods as truth in debates and argumentation. So no, this is not a semantic word game. And in fact, if I were to present a bunch of bad arguments, wouldn't Richard call me on them? Well, of course he would. Wouldn't Richard say, "Oh, that's a fallacious presentation"? Well, now wait a minute. If you've agreed to fallacies and violations of the principles of logic, the laws of logic, then you have to understand and agree and admit that I didn't give you a semantic word game. I gave you an actual argument showing that the claims that you're making are contradictory. You can't say that social mythology and explanations are culturally relative, and my Darwinian evolutionary biology social myth explanation applies at all times to all cultures to explain how humans derive ethics and meaning and the will to survive. Those two claims contradict. So you have it one way where you admit universal truths, but then you'd have to give up your Nietzscheanism. Right? Nietzsche has a problem with this idea of objective eternal truths. Now, if somebody was mad that I mentioned Plato, the only reason I mentioned Plato in the debate was not because I'm a Platonist, but specifically because Nietzsche had such a problem with Plato and objective abstract truth. Nietzsche rails against Socrates, right? And he hates Socrates and Platonism, and he sees Christianity as just kind of furthering the idea of objective truth, which he thinks is a joke. But as we see, Richard quite often operates and appeals and acts like there is universal objective truth. Right? He presupposes this just obvious fact of evolutionary biology explaining all of these things so well, and therefore it must be true. But that really doesn't mesh with Nietzscheanism, right? So what I'm pointing out is that we have, again, this same tension in Richard's worldview, where we want, just like JF, we want to have universal truths and things to ground ourselves in for reason and for science and for logic and for argumentation and for rights and for truth and falsehood, etc., for the survival of the people, and that this should be so, and we have a purpose and this and that. And then we see, on the other hand, the simultaneous admission that the world is not that way at all. Oh no, we are just basically living out our own mythology that we invent, right? Aren't we all in a way LARPers? I mean, and this is literally kind of what Nietzscheanism is about. I mean, this is why Nietzsche gives rise to existentialism. What does Jean-Paul Sartre say? He says, we're all wearing masks and we're all operating in bad faith until we become, quote, authentic. What does that even mean? Right? We're never told exactly what that means, but but this Sartre is getting this from Nietzsche, and Nietzsche is saying, every man is a LARPer, every man is a lawyer, every man is an apologist for himself. He's just trying to make himself look good and to impose his will. But some of us are just weak and we don't do it very well. So that doesn't mesh with the scientific assumption that evolutionary biology is this grand narrative explanation that transcends time and space. I'm sorry, but you can't have both of those things at once. And this is why Nietzsche was so he made such fun of scientism. I mean, Nietzsche laughs and mocks the Dawkins type scientific approach as much as he mocks the weakness of Christianity. I mean, he thinks both are stupid. I've said many times, Nietzsche says that the pale atheists who go around trying to evangelize are just as pathetic as the Christian evangelists. And he makes fun of them. And of course, that's why Richard, wanted to sort of backpedal from any association with fedoras and Dawkins. But you can't have your fedora and your Viking sword at the same time. The Viking sword and the fedora don't mix. But Richard wants to have a fedora, but he's not going to wear a fedora because it's not very fashionable now to wear a fedora. You would immediately be kind of shuffled off into internet oblivion in terms of like, you know, Reddit sphere or something with wearing a fedora. But I can have my Viking sword. Let me have my Viking sword and Odin and somehow mix that with Darwin. No. By the way, the fact that he thinks Nietzscheanism blends with Darwinism so well, doesn't that kind of speak to the fact that Darwinism is a mythology? Of course it does. And that's what we critiqued many times over for many years now. Articles, talks, videos. Those are grand mythologies. And so they fit very well into philosophies that are grand mythologies. But you can't have cultural relativism at the same time. It doesn't work. Now, Richard might say, well, I can have both at the same time because I just don't really care about logic and these enlightenment ideas. Well, now, first of all, hold on. Right. Universal principles of logic, that's not an enlightenment idea. That's an ancient idea. Okay. So here we have perennialism. It's because Richard has an appreciation for perennialism. What exactly does perennialism mean? And by the way, all of these gods contradict. All right, the gods of one culture contradict the claims of the gods of another culture. Right? So we can't have the Roman pantheon and the idea that maybe animism is true. Right? All of these things can't be true. They're not all true at once. And simultaneously, perennialism is not true. Perennialism is not true because you don't have a way to know. And this is the idea of, you know, the schools of Fritjof Schuon and these other characters, Rene Guénon, and they have insights. I'm not saying that the perennialists have no insights. They are useful. They're interesting. But if we read Julius Evola, Evola is a fan of Crowley and sex magic. Now, wait a minute. Is that perennial? Is that traditional? And now Richard got mad when I mentioned pedophilia. I wasn't trying to castigate him personally. I'm just trying to illustrate the unworkability of this ethic. Because it is true. Go back and listen to my Plato lectures that in the dialogues, there is the affirmation of man-boy love in the Platonic dialogues. Now, most of us find that morally atrocious, but when Richard was trying to justify why things are bad, it was because there's an innate sense of things being gross. Well, now, wait a minute. Apparently, in the Platonic dialogues, man-boy love was not gross. So, feeling something to be gross it doesn't work when the same perennial pagan cultures that you're appealing to also find things acceptable that you find gross. Now, when I was saying that, don't we seem to think that, you know, having sex with a dog carcass or something like this is morally wrong? I'm trying to illustrate that there is an innate sense of right and wrong, because Richard had earlier been bringing up, what about moral law? He didn't use that term, but he was saying, how do, ancient Celtic peoples have a sense of right and wrong without Christianity? Well, again, this is because Richard isn't familiar with Christian theology and the idea of the moral law, and the idea that what Paul speaks of in Romans 1, that all men have the sense of right and wrong, or basic conceptions of what you should and shouldn't do on their heart, because they're made in the image of God. Paul explains this in Romans 1. Natural revelation, we could say. Not really natural theology, but natural revelation. So Richard's not really familiar with that. So in his mind, it's like, well, plenty of people lived fine without before Christianity, and so since Christianity is kind of a recent revolution, no. Again, this is because, in our view, we have a 100% continuity with Moses, with Noah, with David, right, with the prophets. They are all over our churches. They are icons in our churches. The Old Testament saints, patriarchs, and prophets are mentioned in every liturgy because we are members of the same heavenly Jerusalem, the same city. They are part of the church, the same church we are in. John the Baptist, St. John the Baptist, this weird ascetic guy down in the Jordan preaching, he is the continuation of the schools of the prophets of Elijah. Same model. And in Orthodoxy today, you have the elders, the starets, you have the ascetics, you have the John the Baptists in our church still. So, and again, this is just another version, a continuation of the idea of the Nazirite law, right? There were ascetic vows that you could take in the Mosaic law, the Nazirite vows. Samson, right, had taken us in some limited sense a Nazirite vow to not cut his hair. And the ascetic practices in the church, modeled after St. John the Baptist, are just a continuation of that. Now, see, you probably didn't know, Richard probably didn't realize that the ascetic tradition, the prophetic tradition, is a continuation of these schools of the prophets that we read about when we read about Elijah and Elisha. The schools of the prophets. So there is a tremendous continuity. Now you say, well, wait a minute, that's ascetics. What about kings? Oh, yes, kings like David who fought, right? Abraham went to battle. The Maccabees fought battles. Oh, Jesus came. That doesn't exist anymore. Not true. You are wrong, and you are way wrong. This is a total ignorance of Christian history. This is why Byzantium is suppressed. You don't learn about Byzantium in modern universities and academia unless you're some kind of specialist weirdo. And that's on purpose. You think the globalists want you to know that your history is that there was an Orthodox empire? Of course they don't want you to know that. They want you to think that Christianity is John Hagee and Jimmy Swaggart and all these clowns. And John Hagee and Jimmy Swaggart and all these clowns, they don't know any of this stuff. So, but I would expect more from Richard, being a historian, to know about these aspects of Christian history. The Serbian kings who went to battle against Islamic sultans, who are heroes and saints. That doesn't work very well for the ecumenists now, does it? The Russian saints who would receive, for example, Metropolitan Filaret's blessing before going to battle. This is 100% in continuity with the Bible. And once you see that, you start to see that these bizarro characterizations of higher critics and people who are neo-pagans or whatever, they really fall away. They really disintegrate because they don't have any force behind them at all. So, this was a big kind of centerpiece of Richard's critique of Christianity was all of these points, the Nietzscheanism, and then he made another interesting thing that I wasn't able to get to. He did talk quite a bit, didn't he? Maybe this was a strategy, was to talk a lot, to not let me bring all of the guns. That's fine. That's okay. I can let people talk. That's fine. But he said Christianity was egalitarian, and it brought this egalitarian heresy of liberalism. This is a neo-pagan, Julius Evola, alt-right, constant criticism. And yes, when you're talking about evangelicalism and when you're talking about modern liberal Catholicism, yes, they have capitulated to social justice warriors and to liberalism and to forms of cultural capitalism and cultural Marxism and all that. They have capitulated, sure, in many, many, many ways. But that is not true of a large portion. It's not true. First of all, it's not true of all of Western Christianity, to be fair. Secondly, it's not true of a large portion of Orthodoxy. Certainly, the same battles against liberalism are going on in the Orthodox Church. Sure. Battles against these radical ecumenism, indifferentism, liberalism, higher criticism, all that. That's been going on for a long time in any religious group. Sure. But, I think it's maybe more fair to say that the Orthodoxy might be split down the middle in terms of this battle. And maybe even not down the middle, maybe even a little more, maybe 70-30. I don't know. But, the Russian, excuse me, I need a drink here. I'm on the Richard Ramble, so I gotta have a drink. So, we were speaking here of history of the church, and I was saying I would have expected more from Richard in terms of being a historian, which was, I think, one of his majors. But when he speaks of this idea of the universalization of human nature leading to radical egalitarianism, yes, it's true that the idea of universal human nature was capitalized on by liberals, and that what liberals did was basically remove Christ and and the supernatural through the higher critics, and then through ecumenism, and through all the Rockefeller-funded seminaries and universities, which is why you have almost a complete dominance of the Rockefellers in terms of liberal Protestantism. They almost single-handedly liberalized the major Protestant denominations, right? The Methodists, the PCUSA, et cetera, et cetera. This is how they did this, through creating and funding seminaries. And they are still doing this, by the way, them and other big donors. So that's how there was the liberalizing, okay, through these big families and oligarchic interests putting money into it. But that's not the only explanation. The other explanation is a long degradation of heresy. Right? This, go watch my video, The Decline of the West. Okay, and I give my explanation of how ultimately it results from theological errors. Right? And this is the Orthodox position. And many Orthodox theologians have been proven right. How many Orthodox theologians, at the time of St. Mark of Ephesus, at the time of St. Gregory Palamas, many times said, if you go this route with this theology, you will then degrade into atheism. I mean, that's what St. Gregory Palamas predicted. This is again, very powerful prophetic statement to Barlaam in their debate, was that if you adopt this theology, it's going to lead you to atheism. And what happens in the West? Total atheism, right, within a few centuries. So Richard doesn't know any of that stuff. And again, I'm not being mean or rude. It's just he's not aware of that stuff. He's not that interested in the theological aspects. I think he would say that it seems boring to him, probably. But whether you think it's boring or not, that really is in the background of that's what people are debating in these centuries. You may think it's boring, but that's what they debate, and the idea is, and these debates have consequences, and they lead to certain views of the world. Read my essay From Thomism to Enlightenment Deism, where I show that absolute divine simplicity and the presuppositions of the Thomistic approaches to created grace and beatific vision, they logically lead to the Enlightenment vision of natural theology. I mean, doesn't it seem a little strange that somebody like Locke can talk about natural theology, just like Kant can talk about natural theology, just like Aquinas can talk about it? Yeah, and that's because natural theology is not true. That's one. And if you want to see that refuted, read Father Staniloy's Orthodox Dogmatics, Volume 1. I don't have time to go into that right now. But, so Richard is not aware of that analysis of the West. He's aware of the cultural analysis, but not the theological analysis. And since everybody in that period was a theologian of note, most likely, right? We're talking about from the time of the Roman Empire, up through Byzantium, and into the modern period. I'm sorry, but theology does matter. These ideas have consequences. And the two different versions of God in the East and the West, two different triads, right, centered around the question of divine simplicity and its resultant filioque, they produced two different churches and they produced two different societies. And that's just a fact. So you can go listen to my other videos if you want to get into the specifics of all that. But this claim that universal human nature was capitalized on by liberals is true. That is what happened in the West. And the reason they were able to do that is precisely because the doctrine of divine simplicity, that God is essentially all of his attributes and properties smushed in and hypostases smushed into one essence. Guess what? If you're made in God's image, then the same thing happens to you. All of your attributes, properties, and your persona, you as a hypostasis, gets smushed into your nature. And so your nature becomes determined. And this is exactly what happens in strong, radical Augustinian theology, and then later in Calvinistic and Lutheran theology, all of which are heavily deterministic and focused on the doctrine of predestination. So once all of your attributes and persona and acts are smushed into your essence and you become identified with your nature, yes, the resulting thing is, guess what? Absolute divine simplicity and its monad is reflected in humanity. And humanity is all the same. It's one big mush, isn't it? Exactly. Right. And that's because of theological errors. It's because of the denial of the doctrine of the nous in the West. Augustine does not teach the nous. Aquinas does not teach the nous. The Eastern Church Fathers do. So, and that's a different anthropology, is what I'm saying. So the bitching about the acceptance of radical egalitarianism and the idea that all human nature is manifested equally, universally in every single person, and thus we get radical social justice and the idea that no people are different or better than other people, is a result of janky, whack, shitty anthropology. That's a result of bad theology. This is why I've done talks on the revealed anthropology of orthodoxy. Go listen to my Logoi talk on St. John of Damascus, revealed anthropology. So in other words, the dialectical reaction against the idea that we are all an absolute divine simplicity of humanity, right? Human simplicity, human natural simplicity, maybe, that we're all smushed into the same nature, and there's not a place for particularity, is a mirror of the Western doctrine, again, of divine simplicity, and it leads to egalitarian conclusions if we go down that road. So it's natural to see a reaction to that in a kind of Nietzschean sense of, I will be the man against time, right? In the Julius Evola sense, I will be the Übermensch to fight this tide of weakness, degeneracy, to bring back, the great warrior, the great man, the great imperium. But the autonomous pagan imperium doesn't work any more than the degraded, degenerate, disgusting social justice equalitarianism works. And that's because they're both secular, autonomous approaches. And that's why you need an orthodox doctrine of the Trinity, where there is what we call equal ultimacy between the one and the many in God. There's no imbalance in God. If your absolute is both absolute in its oneness and absolute in its multiplicity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, then there's a balance between these two, and there's no primacy of the one over the many or the many over the one. So we don't have some giant monad that smushes out all of the particulars, and we don't have a chaotic anarchy of particulars that tries to smash out unity. We have a balance of the one and the many, and this thus should be reflected in human nature and in nations and in cultures. That is the ideal we're shooting for, right? It doesn't always happen. People fight. People are different. Sure. But we want to have balance and diversity within the unity. A true multiculturalism, so to speak. And Richard's version of multiculturalism, which in a way is kind of correct, because yes, he recognizes that there are different cultures, different expressions, different people, different arts, right, that come from different people groups. But the solution to that is not the might makes right. Right? That's not going to work because it's relativistic, and it's also anti-rational. So, and Richard was saying, but you want to, talk about all this rationality and all this stuff. We need to, do the might makes right stuff first, and then we can later hash out the rational explanations of things. Well, I don't see a divide between power and reason, or action and reason, or religious explanation and reason. You see, these are all dialectical divides that were created by Western apostates, right? Faith versus reason. No, there's not a battle of faith versus reason. Reason is a tool that is part of a kind of hierarchy, right? I mean, we don't say that reason is the preeminent thing in man. The preeminent faculty of man is his nous, which is the heart and the mind working together to perceive God and to love God in all things. That is the highest organ of man, and that's the organ or faculty that has been diminished by the fall. So the life of repentance, the life of coming back to God, participating in the sacraments, right, praying, etc., that is the means by which our nous is purified, and by which we do eventually come to see God in all things, the direct vision of God. That's a very different anthropology from what we got from Richard. From Richard, we got a kind of longing for the transcendent, but denial of man ever actually touching the transcendent in this life. We got a kind of biologicization of man, essentially trapped in the here and the now, no access to the transcendent, to the absolute, to universals, to concepts, to principles, maxims, and laws, but at the same time a desire to use those in rhetorical conversation and argumentation. But they're not just word games. They're not, these very complex mathematical principles, for example, build computers. And you don't build computers on word games. You build computers based on real objective principles that operate in the world. So we can't have total relativism and total materialism. And Richard's not a total materialist, to be fair, but it's a kind of a different flavor of atheism, so to speak. And he says, well, it's agnostic. Well, whatever. It's maybe a different flavor of agnosticism that's not so, Dawkins materialist. But let me have my mythology. Let me have my romanticized visions of Zeus and Odin or something. But so what? If, by the way, if those things are just evolutionary biological mechanisms, the mythology, the vision of Odin or something, religion is just, again, an evolutionary mythology, a practical invention, then they're not real. And Richard's, maybe at times we need illusion. Maybe we need the lies at times. But again, this really just kind of puts us into a state of confusion, because if we need the lies at times, how do we know when there's a good lie that we're engaging in, to the to contrast it with a bad lie, right? I mean, it really just becomes nonsense, I think. Anyway, so that fills out my first half critique of Richard's position. We've gone about an hour and a half here. I will take some questions from the audience, and then in hour two, or the second half for subscribers, I have another page here of my notes from the debate, comments and things that I wanted to reply to Richard that I didn't get to. So we'll cover that in hour two for subscribers. But if you want to do some super chats, I will take those now. If you enjoyed this talk, if you enjoyed the debate, Corey says in this super chat, Jesus hung out with trad thoughts. Yeah, I guess in a way he did, because did you know Mary Magdalene had 7 demons? And yes, the Gospels record Mary Magdalene as having 7 demons, which were exorcised from her at some point. And I think there's are there any other? Well, the Pharisees say that he hung out with tax collectors and prostitutes. So I guess in a way, yes, he did hang out with trad thoughts. So thank you, Corey, for that super chat. And any more of you cheapos want to ask me questions? Not going to respond to cheapo questions in the chat. Give me a monies. Give me a monies. I'm kidding. I'm not money grubbing. But 106, 170, 180, I think we got to. That's not bad. Any questions? I'm going to give it a couple more minutes for questions, and then we'll close it down. And tomorrow's hour 2 will be up for subscribers. So this is Jay Dyer from Jay's Analysis. You're listening to my analysis of the debate with Richard Spencer. Richard Pencil. Witzel Pencil. Richard Spencer. And you can go check that out on the Baked Alaska channel. That happened last night. That's where it is. I thought about re-uploading it to my channel, but I don't know if I get iffy about doing that, because I don't know if JF and Worski would, get pissed, or would Baked Alaska get pissed. I don't know if I can just re-upload the video. I might upload the audio or something like that. I don't know. But you can go watch the debate on Baked, the BA, the bowel movement experience. I'm joking. The BO, the BM experience, the BA experience. I'm kidding. I'm joking with Baked. But if you want a question, send your shekels. Send your shekels. I'm kidding. Okay, we have another little question here. This is a good question. Yeah, I meant to get to this with Richard too, because but when things are happening on the fly, and the way Baked does his streams is that he does the big ones for just an hour and a half. They close it down. They don't do the 5-hour Worski debates. So Baked closed it down pretty quick. I didn't get to Dionysius the Areopagite. So Dionysius is a somewhat controversial early church father who, by the time of the Renaissance, there was a revisionist work by people like Lorenzo Valla to redate him as late, as they redate Dionysius as not a first century church father who knew or was associated with St. Paul or mentioned in the book of Acts, but rather is some Neoplatonist from like this 6th century or something. So I actually had an interview slash exchange with the world authority on Dionysius, and this is an Orthodox theologian by the name of Bishop Alexander Golitsyn. You can find that video in the theology playlist on my YouTube channel. We actually get into that. He does have a very profound analysis of Dionysius in terms of the theology proper. So I would, if you are interested in Dionysius, just in general, I would say listen to that, watch that video with Alexander on that topic, because he's basically spent his entire life. I think he went to Oxford or somewhere studying Dionysius. So, of course, being from the academic realm, he does not accept the traditional view that Dionysius is an early church father. I tend to think that he is, and there is a case to be made for that. But the question, of course, was, how does the mystical theology, the ecclesiastical hierarchy, celestial hierarchy, how does this relate to political? In fact, it pretty much always has. The hierarchy that exists in the spiritual sphere is just like the hierarchy that exists in nature, in the family, and in the state. So, there's a head of a household, the father, right? That's why there's monarchy. That's why there's heads of nations. So this is why both in the Old Testament you have the ceremony, the chrismation of the kings, and this passed quite naturally into the history of Orthodoxy with the chrismation of rulers by the church. Because the church has the fullness of spiritual authority, thus rulers who do not control, or hopefully, they don't create the church. It's rather the church that chrismates and grants the authority to the ruler. And that's how it's always been. That was how it was in the West, right, as well. You had, the kings in England back when they were Orthodox. They were anointed. The Russian Tsar is anointed by the church. And this is a coronation, chrismation ceremony. So this is based on the liturgy. This is based on in the liturgy we have all these statements about the principalities, powers, thrones, dominions, cherubim, seraphim, etc., etc. These are the 9 choirs of the angelic ranks. This is biblical. This is not made up Kabbalah. This is from Ezekiel. It's from the Bible. It's from the tradition of the church. So Dionysius may, this is another issue too, is that similarity of language is not the same thing as as causation or origins, right? So this would be kind of a genetic fallacy where people say, because there's a goofball on YouTube who makes this argument, because the word hypostasis is used, and because Plotinus used the word hypostasis, Christianity is Neoplatonism because it uses a term that Plotinus. First of all, this is so stupid. The term hypostasis or person in Greek does not come from Plotinus, right? Plotinus is far after the New Testament and the Septuagint. The Greek word for person is hypostasis. It's used in the Septuagint, the New Testament. It doesn't come from Plotinus. In fact, maybe Plotinus got it from the Bible. I mean, we know that a lot of these Platonic figures like Celsus, right, who had debates with Christians, they were familiar with the biblical text. So it's entirely possible that Neoplatonists, when they wrote their works, they were ripping off Christians. Has this ever occurred to anyone? But no, the presupposition is always that, hypostasis is used in Plotinus, so all the Christians must have just ripped off Plotinus because we know Christians are idiots and Plotinus was the greatest thinker of all time. No. See, it's all based on unquestioned assumptions. So I would say absolutely it affects the presentation of how we view civil order, and that's why it's hierarchical. I mean, look, think about this is how dumb democracy and egalitarianism is. I mean, in no aspect of life is egalitarianism and democracy true. Nowhere. Your business isn't going to run if everybody's equal, right? Your classroom isn't going to work if everybody's viewed as equal. How's a basketball team going to work if everybody's viewed as equal? I mean, can anybody just join your team? I mean, can I just say I'm as good as Kobe Bryant? Right? Well, I mean, we're all equal, right? No, this is so stupid, right? And everybody knows that this is not true from their everyday experience. And so why would we think that we can have all this esoteric, mystical theology of cherubim and hierarchies and all this stuff, and then turn around and think that, I'm a liberal Democrat. Yeah. So everywhere else in my worldview that I believe applies to the here and the now is hierarchical, but I want total equality over here in this idiot realm of politics. No, that makes absolutely no sense. So you bet the hierarchy applies to all areas of life. Now, some people say, well, but what if Dionysius's writings were a late date? As if this like undercuts the idea of hierarchy. I don't think it's true, but even if it were true, all the other church fathers in the Bible teach hierarchy. It's not like everything rests on Dionysius. It's just stupid. So that's my answer to the Dionysius question. Who asked that question? Carson. So it relates directly to political theory is my answer. Because every area of life is hierarchical. The next question. Thank you, Alex, for the super chat. No question. Benjamin Angry Gnostic. Benjamin Angry Gnostic. Why can't abstract objects exist independently of the human mind without God? Okay, so if you read my essay, Numbers Prove God, I go into the theology of St. Maximus the Confessor, who really fleshes out the logos and the logoi. And simply put, if we can establish that there are abstract entities, numbers, universal concepts, and so forth, which I think that we can through a lot of the argumentation that I've given, transcendental arguments and so forth. The next question is, where are they, and how are they, and how do they interact with this world? And so, if we say, well, maybe they're all abstract and impersonal, and they just exist in some sort of floating Platonic realm. The problem is that and this was a problem that Plato had, how do we relate the immaterial, invariant, abstract, unchanging realm to a world that is in perpetual flux? And the result is that we can't. There's no real way to do that because of the fact that Plato's dialectical philosophy is absolute. So he sees this realm as absolute flux and that realm as absolute stasis. And so there's no place for becoming in Plato's philosophy of the here and the now. And so in Orthodox theology, it is precisely the doctrine of the divine energies and the logoi that solves this problem of how the transcendent interacts with the immanent, the here and the now. So it's a little obtuse, it's a little difficult, but what we get is that basically we see that all of these things we could admit are reflected in some way in the human mind, right? So the meaning of a thing, the essence of a thing, the logoi as we call them, behind everything that's out there. If we can admit that these kinds of things do exist, universals, we can see that they are mirrored in the human mind, right? My mind can at different times, in some sense, touch upon the essence of things, right? What a thing is and how it relates to other things and how it has meaning and how it has purpose and all this kind of stuff. I can predicate about things in the external world because I have a mind, because I have reason. have that faculty. But if my mind is all there is, and because I'm finite, how is it that I bridge the gap from my finite inner world, right, my inner subjective consciousness, to something out there in the external noumenal realm? So basically what I'm getting at is that this is the problem in Kant. So even though Kant at times will talk about transcendental categories and this kind of stuff, the question that you're asking is the problem that Kant has. Kant has the problem of saying, okay, so I've made arguments for how there might be transcendental categories, such as the self, etc., but I can't ever get them to the external world. They never bridge the gap between what's in my mind and what's out there. And that's because I have no way to know that what's in my mind matches up to the thing out there. Because all I have on his view is external secondary qualities, and those are always changing. So I can never have any access to any universal or any essence of a thing. Now, on a different kind of anthropology that we would get from somebody like St. Maximus the Confessor, or what we would find in Orthodox theology, is rather quite different. The mind is able to see and tap into the reality, or a kind of direct realism in epistemological speak, because reality is undergirded by a big mind, the divine mind, which is in fact omniscient. And although our mind is a pale, finite reflection, it does show us and give us an insight, an aspect into how the divine mind is and how it functions and how it operates. And that's because we have a relationship with God. Now, I'm not saying that only Christians can see and predicate truths about the external world. Obviously, that's not true. But only Christianity has this anthropology and this explanation to solve the dilemma of Kant, of how the mind is not trapped inside of itself and how it can actually have access to the external world and a common objective reality that we all share. We are all part of the same world. We're all interacting in the same world. The world is not a manifestation of just my mind, some kind of weird solipsism or something. No, it is a common world that God created that we all interact in. And because everything in this world is there because it was created by God, and its essence, so to speak, its logoi, its pattern for its existence, its archetype, is in the divine mind, my mind can tap into that. So in other words, we solve at once in Orthodoxy, through the theology of St. Maximus the Confessor and other great Orthodox thinkers, we solve the dilemma of Plato, and we solve the dilemma of Kant in Orthodox anthropology. So that is my answer to how independently existing objects cannot just be immaterial forces. They have to also be related to something personal. If we just have numbers floating out there, like impersonal forces and numbers out there, these things are not related to one another in a meaningful way. So the ultimate reality for us is not impersonal, which it would be on this principle, this position, which would be a kind of Platonism where, Pythagoreanism would say, oh, there are, things like numbers and mathematical principles that are external to the human mind, but they're all impersonal. Okay, if they're all impersonal, then they do not have a meaningful relationship to us or to themselves. So what you need is kind of an infinite mind, an omniscient mind that does enclose, that does hold all of these things together. And of course, much more, because God doesn't even reveal to us everything of himself. So that's my answer to that question. Corey says, do you agree with the ethno-state in principle? I think that if you look at something like Israel as an example, you see the difficulty of trying to erect a strict, quote, ethno-state. Certainly in the history of mankind, we see the idea of tribes and people groups operating more like that. And it's always been in the Orthodox conception of the Imperium a desire to, again, have a balance of the one, the many, even in this universal sense, right? So the church and the people of Armenia ideally would be in union with the church and the people in Greece, who would ideally be in union with the church and the people in Russia. And ideally, we wish that we could have, everybody coming together in ecumenical councils in the oikumene or in the imperium, where that comes from. And the desire would, of course, be, in the traditional Orthodox sense, for everyone to, as the Russian church statement says, maintain their kin, their patriotism, and defend the homeland. Right? That's ideal. Now, we don't live in an ideal world; we live in a fallen world, so we are constantly having to interact with all kinds of different situations. And so this is why the Orthodox Church, for example, does not have an absolute prohibition on interracial marriage, but it also does not encourage it because of the fact, as many Orthodox theologians, very famous, prominent ones, have said many times over, if we were to do this and allow this and promote this, it would mean that the different people groups that God established, right? It's the reason we have different races and ethnicities is because of God. It's because of what we read in Genesis. It goes against God's plan to try to wipe out all the different cultures and people groups. Right? I mean, Pentecost is about the joining of mankind in the spiritual, supernatural, transcendent kingdom of God. It is not about destroying Babel by creating a Babel mass of people who are all one race. No, that is the liberal social justice warrior weaponized attack on people groups, and we do not believe that. This is why the liturgies prove this. The liturgies show that language, right, which is a powerful, almost essential cultural binding force, right? I mean, the Arab liturgies, right? Arab Orthodox Christians celebrate their liturgies in Arabic, and guess what? They call God in the liturgy Allah, because that's just the Arabic word for God. Right? So actually in the Orthodox Arabic liturgy, you say Allah Akbar. A lot of people don't know that. But it's idiot evangelicals who think that the term itself means that you're a jihadi. That's utterly stupid. Ethnos is an aspect of what tends to make up a state, but I don't think it's realistic to strictly have an ethno-state. I mean, even the closest thing, I mean, you can come close in history. You can have examples that are pretty close. But even examples that come close still are difficult because, and this was one of my chief contentions with Richard Spencer or alt-right, is that a lot of these kinds of positions fall back on the highest organizing principle being something biologically determined, and it's not. And again, this is why it comes down to two different anthropologies. If you have a Darwinian anthropology, then yes, biology is the highest organizing principle. It's going to be the most important. If you believe in orthodoxy and the transcendent, that does matter, but it is not the most important thing. So, this is a very difficult question. Again, go Google the Russian Orthodox Church statement on church and nation, and that is my perspective on this question. So, do I agree with the ethno-state in principle? If the principle is the Orthodox Church's statement, yes. If it's a biologicized eugenics version from National Socialism, no, I don't believe that works. I believe that National Socialism and the 20th century manifestations of that are all engineered. Thank you, Square Peg. Jeff Mullins, thank you. Benjamin again. I'm interested in St. Maximus the Confessor. Which book should I start with? The best book to start with is Cosmic Liturgy, which is from St. Vladimir Simony Press. That's a great one. Then I would read Thurnberg's Maximus the Confessor, the little book that's about, both of these, by the way, are like 200 pages. So one of them was 150, one of them was 200. But both of those are from St. Vladimir Seminary Press. So those are two great starting points for St. Maximus, and they're readable, and they really make a lot of these same arguments. I think Ambigua 7 is Maximus's one of his most famous essays on the logoi. That one's a classic. He explains universals. Also, if you can look up Stephen Clark's paper, which is on academia.edu. I think if you read my Numbers Prove God essay, I have it linked within the essay. His essay on St. Maximus is really good because I don't think he was consciously aware of it, but he was actually touching on what I was trying to argue in that paper about numbers. And he kind of inadvertently touches on it by analyzing Maximus's view of the incarnation and the logoi. So those are necessary reading, and also necessary reading, but very difficult. After you've read those, level 1, and you beat that boss, I would move to level 2 and read Father Florovsky's Creation and Creaturehood, because this is a very difficult essay for if you're new to theology. If you're fluent in theology, it's not going to be too difficult, but it's his very deep analysis of the logoi, and he's solved questions that I've not seen anybody else solve or deal with. So I think it's linked in my recommended reading. But yeah, I would start with Cosmic Liturgy from St. Vladimir's, then I would do Thurnberg's St. Vladimir's brief book, and then I would do Creation and Creaturehood essay. And then you'll be ready to dive into the more advanced St. Maximus stuff if you choose to. All right, so that's everybody tonight. That's the super chats. Thank you for those. I appreciate it. And the rest of this will be available tomorrow for Jay's Analysis subscribers. And I hope everybody enjoyed the debate. And keep your fingers crossed. Pray for a possible discussion with Jordan Peterson. I have no idea if it'll actually happen, but it would be interesting. So hopefully that'll happen. Everybody have a good night. And if you're celebrating Orthodox Easter, Christos Anesti, right? Let's enjoy Easter. Excuse me. Let's say Pascha, Richard. Pascha, the Greek term for Passover. All right. Have a good night.